Hildy is a bawdy, chain-smoking, 70-something former journalist who lives on the Upper West Side in an apartment that has a portal back to 1973. Time travel has rules, though, and Hildy breaks them by traveling back with healthcare aide Trista. Now both women will have to come to terms with their pasts before they lose their chance at having a future. From Ahoy Comics comes Alisa Kwitney's Guilt. That's Gilt, a comic book that's Sex and the City meets the Golden Girls by way of the Twilight Zone. Call your local comic book store and ask them to order your copy of Guilt today. Hey everyone, Lani here. I'm a story expert, owner of Chipperish Media, and the person with 14 years of experience making podcasts. Not that you could tell from this episode. Look, a little behind the scenes here. Alisa hasn't done this before, and she had a new mic and a million new things to learn and didn't realize that the mic would pick up her touching the desk and flipping through pages. That is completely on me, because I'm the one with the experience here. But as I was listening while editing, I realized that not all of the audio issues here are on her end. For some reason, my mic was also picking up my every movement, and I somehow positioned it in a way where it also picked up my breath more than usual. But you know, that happens. There are off days. Okay. But then, about halfway through, Alisa's smoke alarm battery went dead, and it started doing that little intermittent chirpy thing. I don't actually need to warn you about that. I'm pretty sure I edited all the chirps out before she went and replaced the battery, but you should have that context because right after we got done with that, the guy who lives in my neighborhood that likes to ride his motorcycle past my house when I'm recording, well, he rode his motorcycle past my house when I was recording. Because of course he did. Then about an hour in, you'll notice what sounds like a dozen or so chirping birds who I can only presume were sewing Alisa's dress for the Prince's Ball. It's kind of lovely, so that's not actually a warning as much as a, hey, you're going to want to notice this when it happens. But wait, we're not done, because a few minutes after the dressmaker birds finally calm down, sirens go past my house. Sirens. So now, at this point, while I'm editing, it just became funny. But I wanted to give you guys a heads up because at first, for those of you listening on headphones, the sound issues might bother you a bit in the beginning. But the content is great. Alisa is brilliant, and I would listen to her talk next to a construction site, so trust me, it's worth it. Plus, after a while, the shit gets funny. And when you start laughing, and trust me, you will, I would like you to remember that I spent hours editing most of it out. What's left is the stuff I either couldn't get out or it was after it was funny and I was like, fuck it, it stays. And that's why we're not re-recording this episode, because this is how life works. It is imperfect and it's messy, and I wouldn't have it any other way because perfection is a destructive pursuit. So enjoy the show, and for those of you who are new, welcome to Chipperish Media. Welcome to Endless, a Sandman podcast from Chipperish Media. I'm story expert and naked man in a glass box, Lani Diane Rich.
And I'm writer, DC Comics editor, and sleep demon, Alisa Kwitney.
Today on Endless, we are going to be talking about the intro and Volume 1, Preludes and Nocturnes. Issue 1, Sleep of the Just, which was written by Neil Gaiman and illustrated by Sam Keith and Mike Dringenberg.
You threatened and cajoled and pleaded for gifts that were not mankind's to receive, nor mine to give. Time to wake up.
Alisa, here we are. We're finally, after all these months of talking about this project, you and I are hanging out together, and we're going to be talking about Sandman. And this is so exciting and so fun for me because I'm relatively new to like reading comics critically. So working with you, DC Comics editor, you worked on the Sandman series itself. This is really, really exciting. So first, welcome to the world of podcasting. We're so happy to have you.
Thank you. It's been terrifying with the microphone levels, but now my dog is resting at my feet and all is good.
Everything is completely fine, and we are moving through this. This is anybody who listens to Chipperish Media knows that I do this rather frequently. Is I will talk to somebody and I'll just be like, "Hey, let's do a podcast together. Trust me, it'll be fun." But this podcast was actually your idea. I pulled you in for an episode of Jed Bartlett is My President way back in the beginning, like one of the first things that I did in Chipperish. Loved working with you. You and I have kind of been in the same writing circles for a long time. But it was your idea to do a podcast on Sandman. Why did you decide you wanted to do that?
Well, one of the things I love listening to your shows, I love using stories, usually they're television shows or books where people take them and analyze them and use them as a way of talking about writing and story structure. And I thought, I haven't really seen that done with comics yet. And since Sandman's going to be a Netflix TV series, I thought it would have two good functions. One for people who might be interested in, how the sausage is made, so they could make some comic sausage. That would be useful. And that, for people who might be interested in the TV series, this would give them a way to, we can hold their hands while they read comics, either for the first time or for the first time since, they grew chest hair.
I love it. All right. So here we are now. We're at the beginning of Preludes and Nocturnes, right? We're looking over the introduction, which is, a quick intro from Patrick Rothfuss and also from Karen Berger, who is a Sandman editor and the editor that actually launched the Sandman series. But what we're talking about today, as far as the narrative, is the first issue, Sleep of the Just, which sets up like the launching pad for this whole thing. So I'm just curious, what's your overall feeling about this issue?
Well, this is the issue that hooked me. So I think 90 or 91. And I was in graduate school at Columbia's fiction writing program, and I knew I was going to need a job. And so I ended up asking, I sent out letters to Marvel and DC, and I came in for an interview. And they gave me a bunch of comics to read, of the current comics. And one of those was Sandman. And while I don't know if I waited a week or 2 weeks to hear back, if I had the second interview, I went and spent about, I can't remember how many comics after the first issue had already been, but I went and bought them, knowing that if I were hired, I would get them free, because this first issue just hooked me completely. I remember just, it was cold chills and happiness. And I felt, like Neil was, singing my life with his scary, scary words and pictures.
He does that. He really has that effect. He's an absolutely amazing writer. And this was actually done toward the beginning of his career. I mean, he was kind of unknown before this.
He was. I think that, when they were looking for an artist or for an artistic team, they had to find someone who'd be willing to sign on to a monthly with this, nothing unknown writer.
And here we are all these years later. And we're about to launch this Netflix series, which is really exciting. We're definitely going to be talking about that a little bit later. I actually really enjoyed Sleep of the Just. I am really hard to catch at the beginning of a story. I have to really push myself through the first couple of chapters and give it a chance to get me, Oh, yeah. Sandman did that pretty much straight off with Sleep of the Just. There was so much happening in here. And there were so many interesting ways in which the narrative worked. And in episodic series storytelling, there's a really interesting way you can work with the narrative, because Dream, as the Sandman, as our eponymous character, is actually not the protagonist of Sleep of the Just as an independent episodic story. But I just Neil has been able to grab me with pretty much everything that he's ever done. I'm trying to think of a novel of his that I've read where I wasn't completely into it right from jump, and I cannot think of one. I'm like, Anansi Boys, into it. Ocean at the End of the Lane, into it. Haven't read Coraline, but I did see the movie, and I think I would be into it. So there's just something that Neil has this ability to kind of pull a story through these places of metaphor, into the moment that you're in, and just make it a place that you can sit down in and be like, all right, let's go, And the thing is that right now in this process, I am really just starting to get my graphic novel, like comic book sea legs, because when I go into a story, like I'm all about the narrative. I don't often care about the visual art. And I mean, I, was a television and film major in college. I was always into TV and film, but I was always about the narrative. And if I could just listen to it and get the narrative, like I really don't care about the visuals as much. But the thing with comic books is that the narrative itself is so dense. You're reading a page, but you're not just reading the words on the page. You have to read every stroke of the pen, every bit of color. And that really forces me, as somebody who is simply about what are the characters doing and why are they doing it, that I need to be here for the visual experience. And I've already read the entirety of Preludes and Nocturnes as of the time of this recording. And I had read Sleep of the Just, but I read it the way that I read everything, where I'm like zipping through it. I'm like, let's go. And then when I sat down for today's episode and, read these pages very deeply, looking at the art, looking at every little stroke of the pen, I realized how much more I got from that experience. And I love that this is an exercise in slowing down and in savoring a narrative. And I think that's something that's essential when you're reading comic books.
Absolutely. One of the interesting things in terms of writing comics is that you're trying to write in a pretty spare way. This was written as a full script, kind of like a TV or a film script. One of the differences is that after the editor, the person who's going to read the script the most is the artist. So a lot of Neil's skill is communicating with an artist. Maybe some of the details won't exactly make it onto the into the art, because some of the details are about mood, are about what someone's feeling or thinking, so that it transmits through the artwork. Neil's really good at not over directing an artist and not, saying, often beginning comic book writers will say the person frowned or whatever. And so they're sort of directing the artist in a puppet master sort of way. So this is a different kind of writing. And because the artist will have to look back at this again and again, it's a very spare writing. And in a way, what you get is the kind of phyllo pastry, densely packed meanings and symbolism that you get in poetry.
Mm-hmm. Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And it does require that deeper, slower reading. And for anybody who may be new to me and my whole theory work that I do with storytelling and reading, reading is what you do when you engage with any narrative critically. So if you are engaging with a video game critically, you are reading. If you are engaging with, of course, a comic book critically, you are reading. TV shows, movies, you are reading them. So a lot of times you'll hear me refer to reading regardless of which format we're in. When we move to the TV show, I will talk about reading the TV show. That is just standard language for me because you are reading. Audiobooks, also reading. And I don't understand why anybody would say otherwise. But anyway, so it's reading is independent of form. But that deep reading that you do with comic books, and that I'm learning to do now, which is another reason. I mean, aside from the fact that this is introducing me to a property that is new to me, which is really, really fun. What I'm really enjoying now is learning to do that deep reading rather than this rushed kind of, skimming through the text of something, to actually spend that time sinking in and letting your skin get pruny with all of the art and and every single word, every single bit of dialogue, everything has so much meaning, is carrying so much weight. I mean, this is like a lot of work for very, very little to do for a single page or a single panel. So anyway, all right, let's go ahead, I guess, and get into our summary.
Absolutely.
In Sleep of the Just, we open in June of 1916 with Dr. John Hathaway of the Royal Museum showing up at Roderick Burgess's house with the Magdalen Grimoire, which Burgess has requested and Hathaway had originally refused to hand over. Hathaway recently lost his son in the war, however, and he hands it over to Burgess and asks if he'll really be able to stop death. Burgess says yes and plans to hold his ritual at the next full moon. No one need ever die again, says Burgess. A few days later, it's almost midnight, and we see multiple people dreaming about the mundane to the pleasant to the terrifying, while Burgess prepares for the ceremony, saying that even if they fail, he has control of Hathaway, and the Royal Museum will be theirs to plunder. In the dark with his group of mages, Burgess performs the ceremony, meant to capture death, and he fails, but it's not a total loss. He hasn't captured death, but he has captured the King of Dreams, and that ain't nothing. He takes Dream's ruby, helmet, and pouch of sand, and leaves him naked in a glass cage. Across the world, our dreamers either fall asleep with little waking or stay awake in terror of their dreams. Either way, something is very, very wrong. Roderick Burgess keeps Dream imprisoned, and Dream waits. 1920, 4 years later, Professor Hathaway commits suicide after he is disgraced over the loss of many important manuscripts from the Royal Museum. He hopes his suicide will unmask Roderick Burgess, but Burgess uses magic to burn Hathaway's suicide note, and the man dies in disgrace. Meanwhile, the world is being overtaken by the sleepy sickness, in which people dream but don't wake, or stay awake always, and end up killing themselves. 1926, Burgess is frustrated that the prisoner won't talk. His son Alex figures out that they have captured an endless named Dream, which Burgess already knew, which is why he ordered the guards never to sleep while watching over him. 1930, Ruthven Sykes, Burgess's second-in-command, takes off with Burgess's girlfriend Ethel Cripps and many of the Order's treasures and heads to San Francisco, where he trades Dream's helmet to a sibilant demon in return for protection. He is given an amulet that kept him safe until Ethel took off with it in 1936, leaving Sykes susceptible to Burgess's magical wrath. 1939, the sleepy sickness continues to take hold of its victims, except Wesley Dodd, who goes out at night and uses gas to put bad guys to sleep, and then puts sand in their eyes. Wesley Dodd sleeps the sleep of the just. 1947, Roderick Burgess dies. 1955, his son Alex tries to get Dream to agree to give him power, immortality, and promise that Dream will not exact revenge upon his release. Dream refuses. In the 70s, Alex hands over the running of the Order to his boyfriend Paul, who uses it as a scam machine. In the 80s, Alex begs Dream to just do what he asks, and Dream refuses and waits. In 1988, one of the guards falls asleep while guarding Dream. Dream collapses, and the guards open the case to see if he's dead. When they do, he blows sand on them, and they fall asleep. 72 years, Dream is finally free. Weakened, he travels through dreams, grabbing food and clothing. Now, he wants his stuff back. Alex Burgess dreams and finds himself before Dream on a throne. He weakly tries to apologize, but Dream isn't interested. Dream curses him to eternal waking, living in nightmare as he sleeps. Okay, so very, very cool stuff. Now, I have called our main character, our Sandman character, Dream. That's kind of one of his names, but also like Morpheus is one of his names. And so there's a lot of stuff I think we get to a little bit later. So if you hear us calling him Morpheus, Dream, same dude, right?
Yes, he's got other names. One of, you also mentioned the Endless. And so for newcomers, the Endless are a family of archetypal concepts. And they are, in this mythology, older than the gods. And there's this idea that we're going to get introduced to, that gods rise and fall in power depending on the number of people who still believe and worship in them. Kind of the Tinkerbell idea that, you know, you lose power when you lose worshipers. But the Endless are not as beholden to this kind of belief. They gain their power perhaps just from the primariness of a lot of these concepts. And I think one of the things that's really, really cool here is that we start out, of course, with a classic story idea of, why should we care about this character? Well, we're going to see somebody who has lost his power and all of, his possessions, and it's a comeback story. Mm-hmm. But we also start with a character that is, he's defined by being not death in the beginning. And you think death is the exciting one, is the powerful one. And you think, well, dream, that's lesser. And a large part of what Neil is doing there is setting you up to learn just how important and powerful dream is, both as a being and as a metaphor.
And as a concept,
yeah, as a
absolutely.
Concept.
Well, this is one of the things, too, that gets you grounded in character, is that you open up with vulnerability. One of the things that I teach in my narrative theory courses is that character is basically kind of a balance of three elements, that we've got strengths, the things they can do, weaknesses, the things they can't do, and then vulnerability are the things that can hurt them. And so here we have Dream, who is an extremely powerful character, who is, at the very beginning, the first moment we meet him, struck low. Everything's taken away from him. He is captured. He is encased in glass. He cannot leave, and he's also not even the one that they wanted. He's not even, so he's the consolation prize, and so all of that together is insult upon insult. And then all we see is this dude who just waits. His superpower is the ability to just wait, And one of the things that I find really interesting about Sleep of the Just is that Dream is actually not the protagonist of this story, this episode.
Funny little side story to this is that originally Neil Gaiman wanted to write a character called the Phantom Stranger. And and I think my memory, which is now a little cobwebby, is that he was told, no, that character is sort of mysterious, but he's not a proactive enough character to be this main protagonist. We want you to pick a more, active central character. And, in the end, of course, Neil ends up writing The Sandman, and he is often not the key chief, mover and shaker in his stories. He's always a catalyst. And in the end, he does have a very strong story arc, but it's very much an ensemble kind of writing,
which is really interesting. Now, of course, it's, it's on the label, right? Preludes and Nocturnes. This is a prologue story, Sleep of the Just. This launches us into what will be Dream's story, as we move through Preludes and Nocturnes. But what I find interesting is that here we are introducing this character, and in the opening story, he's not even the protagonist. The protagonist basically has three qualities. We see the story through their POV. Their active pursuit of their goal provides the motive force for the story, and they have the most to lose if they fail. Roderick Burgess is actually the protagonist. He is the one in active pursuit of a goal. And when he dies, he passes his protagonism on to his son, Alex. So between Roderick and Alex, they are the protagonists of this story. And again, for anybody who just needs a little clarity on this, heroes and villains do not map to protagonist and antagonist. Protagonist is actively in pursuit of a goal. We're in their POV. They have the most to lose. And the antagonist has one job: block the protagonist, right? So here we have Dream is the antagonist of this story. And what I love about this is that his power comes in his ability to just outlast them. He does nothing except refuse them. And they come and they ask him and they say, we will set you free. Just do this for us, whatever. And he's like, no, and so it's so neat at the end how when Dream becomes free, we are now flipping and he becomes the protagonist. He is in pursuit. We have a classic quest set up, right? He's got to get his ruby. He's got to get his hat. He's got to get his little patch of sand, right? So he's got all these things that he has a very specific goals that he is in pursuit of, and he suffers quite a lot. His power is incredibly depleted. He has to run through all these dreams. He barely has enough energy to curse the shit out of Alex, so that the remainder of his days can be just as miserable as is deserved, and he will get and exact his revenge. But I love that little flip at the end, and then we are getting the launching pad ready for Dream's pursuit of his goal, which I think is really fun.
One of the things that this method of storytelling gives us is myth making. Because I think part of what Neil does so well is create stories that feel like ancient myths in and of themselves. And, if you're going to invest a character with mystery and power, you really can't have them constantly on stage, and you certainly can't have them explaining a lot. So there's a lot of building up of Sandman as as this mythic character, someone who's both powerful and sort of inscrutable and enigmatic. And I think that's part of the reason why the story starts the way it does.
Yeah, no, it's really good. And we have this incredible time scale, right? This is like an 80-year
it was changed for Netflix, I believe, because 1988 is no longer the current moment. Right. So I think they changed it to whatever it is, 125 years. So that's, Sandman just waits even longer.
Fun.
Yes.
Oh, that's going to be really fun. Yeah, I like that. But yeah, I mean, it's a long time scale for one, relatively short story, right? That's just sort of launching this whole thing. And one of the things that I talk about in my narrative writing courses is that you have to think about your scale. Like, what is your scale? That at a certain point, you lose your momentum, right? If there isn't a time pressure on it. That's why, it's a classic thing that, you got to make $50,000 in 30 days or you're going to lose your gym, like that kind of thing. Like, that's a classic kind of time lock pressure that writers will put in their stories, which are really effective at building a basic, structure that you can work with. But here we have the exact opposite of that. We have, he'll just wait. They're mortal. They're gonna die. And the thing that's really interesting is that the thing they were trying to capture and control in the first place is death. And that death, the concept of death, right? The concept of time passing and then what eventually happens to all mortals, is that they're going to die. That is the thing that brings them down in the end. In order to have that, in order to have him live out not just Roderick Burgess's timeline, but his son Alex's timeline as well, is that he can just sit there and wait. And the incredible effect that this has, it's kind of one of those situations where this is when we understand why writing is about principles and not rules, right? It is not a rule that you have to have a time lock and the pressure and that you can't have a grand time scale, but that if you're going to do a grand time scale, you've got to make sure you're going to be able to make that work. And Neil Gaiman does that beautifully here, because with all this time that passes, as we see these lives that are lost, we have a couple of, people that we revisit throughout this time scale, and we see that their lives are just being eaten away by Dream's absence, that's the sleepy sickness. And so we're moving through this, and it charges Dream with that powerful sense of age and mystery and mythology. And so while it's not something that I would recommend in the hands of a novice, here we have Neil Gaiman, who really knows how to make that work. And he doesn't need that principle of the time lock, because he is locked in time, because time has different meaning for somebody like Dream.
For someone who is endless.
Endless.
And, there's something else that gets set up in this first issue, which is, I think, what hooked me and maybe part of what hooked you. I think that right away you can see that this is not just a story where you're deep in the point of view of one protagonist and you're going to see the world just through their eyes. It's not even the kind of ensemble book, which I also enjoy, where, you're going to follow this band of 5 people and in turn you'll find out about each of them. No, what you get here is glimpses of stories that could be entire comic books or novellas in their own right. So you get, a woman who is mysteriously unable to wake, another person who's, haunted by nightmares. You get all of these they're vignettes, the way they're described to us, but you could see how each of them is sort of a story in its own right. And that's one of the things that it's both deeply personal, but, Neil is setting up here. This story will take you all over the place. You will see the people who are impacted by these mythic events and you will care about them. Some of them are going to get punished. Some of them are going to get rewarded. And then the thing which makes this an unusual horror story is it's not just the evil who are punished, which is the way a lot of horror works. And it's not just that good people come to bad ends, which is the way other horror stories often go. It's that like real life, there is a certain random element to whether the evil will be punished, the good will suffer unintentionally. There's a funny, nuanced side to it.
Well, yeah, it's one of the things that we look for in fiction is that it kind of distills down life. Life is noisy, right? And in any given moment in real life, you've got like 85 things going on at once, fiction focuses on one line, or sometimes multiple lines, but like it's focused around a theme or around what it is that you're doing in that particular story so that we can focus on it and understand the complete arc of that narrative, from beginning to end. And the thing that a lot of times we look for our stories to provide is a sense of emotional justice, right? The good end well and the bad end badly, and everything at the end of the story is put right. And most of our stories actually do that, at least in Western culture. We really like the idea that there is justice in the world, that there is some kind of fairness. And I see in Sandman, and of course, without having read the whole run, I cannot speak for the whole run, but that is not an interest in this story, that is not what we're talking about. We're not talking about justice. We're talking about how things happen, how evil really works. And evil works by, creating suffering for good people. And then bad people like Roderick Burgess, didn't really lose much. He was incredibly powerful and he lived a long life. He kept this guy, prisoner. But he got what he wanted. I mean, even, when his trusted sidekick, Ruthven Sykes, ran off with his girl and his stuff, eventually, because Ethel also ditched Ruthven after a while and took all the things that were protecting him, he was able to get his vengeance, So Roderick Burgess, as a really bad dude who was like, hey, I may not have captured death, but now I got this dude, I'll accept this consolation prize and keep him in a glass bubble naked for decades, but also like that he just, he'll plunder the Royal Museum and take all these manuscripts and all of this stuff. Like he's a bad dude who gets to live a long life and, die in his sleep. Like, he doesn't suffer a whole lot. Alex suffers, a bit at the end. Alex is kind of the weak, son who he didn't really want to do it. He's got this whole thing where like, it wasn't me, it was daddy. But at the same time, he's still demanding the same thing, infinite power, immortality, and a promise not to exact revenge, from Dream. And the thing that I love too is that, Dream, when he faces down Alex, is like, you demanded from me something that I couldn't give you and that you weren't owed. That was not yours to wield. It was not yours to have. It was not mine to give. And I love that moment where he's like, you demanded something of me that I couldn't give you anyway. And you kept me captive this whole time. And he exacts revenge on Alex, which, the same way that trauma is generational, evil can be generational too. Like, it gets the sins of the fathers, right?
Absolutely. But one of the great things that's also being set up here is a bit about Dream's character. I mean, right away, we can see that he is patient, but, there's that old love is patient. Well, in his case, vengeance is patient. He really wants to, he wants vengeance, and he is rigid. And we're going to see more of it. But these aspects of who Dream is, the choices he makes, and how he does wield his power is going to really set things up for the whole arc of his character through the series. And that's a difference, I think, from how comics that I knew had worked in the past. There was, we're going back into the late 80s, early 90s. Not only were comics different, TV was different. So when you had some serialized, story that was coming into your home every week or every month, these characters tended not to change. I'm trying to think of that era, Cheers, Sam the barman was not someone who was going to, over the course of very long series, they did begin to change, but that was actually the development.
Because we had to reset.
Yes.
We had to reset every week so that reruns could be viewed in any order, and it didn't matter. We didn't start to see serial storytelling, real story arcs happening in television until we had the record, until we had VCRs, until people had the ability, as I did with Moonlighting, every Tuesday night at 9, I ran home and I made sure that I had the tape in so that I could get all of Moonlighting.
Moonlighting.
Yes.
No one's mentioned that to me in so long. I loved it. Well, okay, that's another story. But
oh my God. Well, one of these days we'll do a podcast on Moonlighting. It'll be awesome.
Would love that. So exactly what you're saying, that this, and one of the cool things that we can say here at the beginning about Sandman is it was really one of the few comics at that point that was allowed to end when the writer had finished his arc. We think of Batman and Wonder Woman. A writer would come with a very strong version of the character. Sometimes they would have new origin stories for that character. But when that writer was finished, someone else came in and continued that property. And so, one of the things that made Sandman singular was, I think, people recognizing, people like Karen Berger and Paul Levitz, who was then president of DC Comics, that this was something really special and it should be allowed to live and have its arc and then finish.
Yeah, no, and that's a wonderful thing too, to be able to have that singular vision, bring it from beginning to end, which is something you don't get a lot in comics. Comics actually share a lot of DNA with soap operas, and that you just keep that story rolling and you just keep doing it, and whatever it takes, you just keep moving. And if a writer leaves and another one comes in and picks up the thread and puts it in their own way. But that's why you would have, situations in soap operas. I was a big fan of Days of Our Lives in the 80s, watched all of that. Oh my goodness, Alisa, how did we not meet so much earlier in our lives?
I just need to tell you that I had a friend who was the head soap writer. I think it was As the World Turns. And when I was working as an editor at TC, she told me that she could hook me up. And if I wanted to write for the soaps in the 80s,
oh my goodness.
She would. So I had to make a decision if I was going to stay with comics or go to soaps. And I stayed with comics. But anyway, that was my road not taken.
There's a lot of shared DNA there, though. There really is, because you just have to grind that story out. And so this is where you see how form will really affect narrative. One of the things I talk about is that narrative is narrative, and regardless of form, story is story is story. But how that story expresses itself is what the form does. The form gives you the form for carrying the story. It is the delivery mechanism for narrative. And so the form that you're working with is going to inevitably have a huge huge influence on the ways in which those stories are finally realized. And comics and soap operas had a lot of that same kind of grinded out daily episodic, nobody could record it. So, there was always somebody who was paying attention, but people wouldn't remember what was going on back then. So if you change that backstory, or if you change the way this character works, or if you rapidly age somebody who was 5 yesterday, who today is 18 and having wild sex, right? That's the kind of thing that just go with it. That's kind of how it works. So to see in a comics format at this same time period that television was starting to get into these longer arcs, we were moving in television from the age of the producer, like the Norman Lear, kind of thing, James L. Brooks kind of thing, into the story, the showrunner creator, where we get into your Joss Whedons and your Glenn Gordon Caron from Moonlighting. We had story arcs going on in Moonlighting too. That was one of the earliest places where that happened. Your big story arcs in X-Files with Chris Carter. We're seeing more and more of these showrunner creators kind of come in, take a story and arc it completely, until now we're at that point where we know, as much as anything, as much as the stars, we know who the creator is on that show. Breaking Bad is Vince Gilligan. We got Carlton Cuse and Damon Lindelof, of course, launched by J.J. Abrams with Lost, right? So all of those names because those showrunner creators are also celebrities in those stories. And I see that Neil is doing this with Sandman, which I absolutely love.
Yeah, and it's interesting, as you were saying this, I was thinking about how Fleabag and Phoebe Waller-Bridge has another writing partner who's pivotal, whose name I'm blanking on. I should have looked at.
Oh, no.
But she's got the writing partner that is, I guess, the lesser known side of things. And this might be a good moment for me to just talk for a second about the artwork and the role of the artist here, because comics are really collaborative. Whenever I teach comic books, especially to prose writers, I say, if you don't want to collaborate, if what you want is just to be, captain of the ship completely, then prose is a much better way to do that. In order to take advantage of a collaboration, you have to like dancing with someone else. And so, if you're just wishing that you could draw the whole thing, and I think people often act as though, I'll just hire someone to draw this. And I'm thinking, but the art is what traditionally it was the artist who was more important in comics because it was about the art. So in this case, Sam Keith was the penciler. So when you're looking at this artwork, Sam Keith was the penciler and Mike Dringenberg was the inker. And I'll just take a moment to talk about that.
Yes.
So Sam Keith was chosen. I think he had a very cool, illustrative style, illustrative style. He, could use a lot of shadows. There was a nice horror feel. He also did a kind of, there are places where he goes a little less realistic, more exaggerated. And he brought in Mike Dringenberg, who, kind of was a good marriage so that it didn't go too cartoony or caricaturish at any point. I mean, that was a really glorious look. And it was after this issue that Sam felt he just wasn't happy, I guess, with how this was, how he was not satisfied with his art, although I'm very satisfied. I love it. He also has a great sense of design, which is you look at some of these pages and they're just beautifully designed to lead the eye and create this wonderful atmosphere. So he agreed to stay on through this first storyline, but was already talking about going. And so we will see after this first storyline, Mike Dringenberg takes over as the penciler. And back in the day, also nowadays, a lot of the artists are doing things digitally. This was all done on comic book boards. So we had actual pencils. Sometimes the pages would smell like cigarettes if the artist was a smoker. So it was a much more concrete, physical thing. I'm going to mention just one other thing. I'm just going to double check the colorist because that's was it Danny Vazzo here? You think I would know this. This was before I actually came to work on the book. So Yeah. So Danny Vazzo was the colorist. And so he's also one of the contributing artists. And that's a whole wonderful school of how you use color to signal flashback, to sort of, impact on mood. The last person that was contributing to this is Todd Klein. So Todd Klein was an amazing letterer. This was all hand lettered. And he was known, he's just won, like every year there's a lettering award. Todd Klein always won it because he was doing things like creating different fonts for alien languages and
that's all by hand. These aren't fonts. They're like he's creating a lettering style.
Yes, and
that represents that.
He did that. So what we used to do is we had a production, bunch of people in production, and so for the Sandman's balloons, which are reversed. Instead of, white with a black holding line, you get that reversed and the lettering itself is white. So he was, that would be done in production, downstairs in-house. And all of that is really different now. But I just want to say that all of these are things that contribute to our experience. And so there was this creative team. Just the fact that, that Morpheus's, that Dream's word balloons are reversed. I don't know exactly how that sounds in my head. I've never had an exact sound for that. But what it meant is that I could see that he was other, that even sometimes when God spoke, their lettering style was not reversed, and it made him significantly different. It was a kind of special effect that really is unique to comics.
Yeah. And that is a visual cue. Right? Again, so you have to be reading it carefully and looking at all of those choices and how they differ. Terry Pratchett did that a lot with in his work and his Discworld novels. The gods would have a different font and be all caps. Whenever Death spoke, it was all caps, and it always had an impact. And I love that. I mean, to me, when I read it, it reads as telepathic rather than spoken. Yeah. So to me, and his voice to me feels very quiet and very gravelly and very much someone with whom you should not fuck, right? So I like, that's how it reads to me, but that's because of the way that I bring all of that together, in my understanding of it. So I'm loving all of this like insight behind the scenes, which is awesome. And the thing that I also love about working with you on this is the deep well of knowledge you have about all of these things. So we have a segment in Endless, the Sandman podcast, called Lucien's Library, which is something that you named, and I have no idea what it means because I haven't read that far. Can you explain to us what Lucien's Library is?
I think that was the letter column was Letters in the Sand. So Lucien is a character. We're going to find out that Dream has a kingdom, and the kingdom is called the Dreaming, and it is composed of our dreams, and it is where we all go when we dream at night. And in that, there's a castle. And there is a library in the castle. And in that library are all the books never written. So I know that I have contributed quite a few tomes there. I believe, many of my friends have. And, some are writers and some are, but how many of us have not written a book that we, maybe even have titled? So, so it just seemed like the right title for bits of esoterica.
Yeah. So what esoterica do you have? Now, okay, here's the thing for people who are listening, a little behind the scenes stuff. I don't know anything about anything. Like some of you may be coming here from Listen Up A-Holes, in which my whole shtick was that I don't know anything about anything. And Joshua Unruh would come in and give me all of this background information in the comics that was just beyond my understanding. He did all of the research. But I have now, from that experience, picked up the ability to kind of like guess where there might be an Easter egg. And I found one that I'll bring in after you're done and see if you don't already have it to talk about. But all right, so bring us through Lucien's Library. Let's get into the esoterica in this issue.
Okay, so as I may have mentioned, I fell in love with Sandman right away. And one of the things I recognized early on as a Sandman reader, and you'll see this, I think, in the next issue, is that we're going to meet characters that if you were a reader of DC Comics back in the 70s, you will recognize them right away. But then there were other references that may seem just like throwaways. So I don't have the page open in front of me, but when the Elder Burgess, when Roderick Burgess is doing the summoning that he thinks is going to get him death and gets Dream, he calls out a bunch of names. All right, so I have opened to the page of the summoning, and the line is, I summon you in the names of the old lords, Namtar, Alatu, Morax, Nabirius, Klesh, Vipar, Maimon, we summon. Now, I have no idea if I've pronounced those all right. That's not in my usual dialogue, but so we're gonna go into our way back machine. And so back when I was an assistant editor on this book, you know, there wasn't the internet was a you know, in its infancy, and so there was no Google where you could just look this stuff up. And really the precedent is that writers of horror will make this stuff up. So if you see Beelzebub, you know that's, you know, an accepted big demon name, which is Hebrew, by the way, for Lord of the Flies, though not everyone knows that. But if you got these little names, you know, people would just make that up. But Neil, I discovered pretty quickly as I was working on the books, didn't make stuff up. He would actually have the research, and these would be real names of chthonic, you know, obscure deities. Yeah. So, ridiculous little story. I was trying to seem more knowledgeable. I didn't know what to do. And after work, I went into my local paperback exchange where they would have books of mythology. I don't know even why I didn't go into a proper, you know, bookstore with tomes, but I was probably rushing. And they didn't have any mythology books, but there was a lovely woman there. And she said, well, I might have some at home. Why don't you come to my apartment and I will.
Oh, my goodness.
Yes. And I will, you know, so I naturally went with her to her apartment. And I had forgotten this till years later. I was at a reading and the fantasy writer Tamora Pierce was there. And she reminded me that she was that woman. So,
oh my goodness.
Yeah, so that was a pretty weird, but anyway, here in Lucien's library, one of the first things that we will mention is that anytime there are names dropped, you can rest assured that they are not just Neil Gaiman making stuff up, but actual names of obscure minor demons and deities.
Yeah. Well, okay. Now I'm going to tell you the thing that I picked up because I was so proud of myself, right? I know that there was an original Sandman in the golden age of DC, right? That there was already a hero called Sandman. It was completely different. And so when they're going through all of the people who are sleeping, they mention this dude, Wesley Dodd, yes! Right? And I saw him wearing that outfit, which looked super, you know, super golden agey. And so they had him and they said like he actually doesn't have the problem with the dreaming because every night he goes out and he gets the bad guys by shooting them up with gas, and he wears a gas mask. And we have like the helmet for Dream, which looks like a gas mask kind of, you know, crossed with that plague era doctor's, you know, mask that would protect them during the plague, that kind of like big horn nose sort of thing. And so we're seeing that influence there. But of course, I looked up Wesley Dodd. Of course, he was the original Sandman. Of course, that was his shtick. He would go out and he would either use the gas that would make the villains tell the truth, or he would just put them to sleep and drop sand on them. And then the police eventually would find them, you know, napping in the middle of downtown New York, I guess, whatever. But I loved that I saw it, and I've been trained by Joshua Unruh, who I'm going to give full credit for the fact that my eyes have now attuned that when I see something like that, I'm like, oh, I'll bet that was the original Sandman. And it was. And he had him in July of 1939, which is when the first original Sandman Golden Age issue came out.
That is beautifully caught. And I think that one of Neil's and the artists and Sam Keith and Mike Dringenberg's contribution is that Neil took this Golden Age character who wore a gas mask, and then created a mythology in which instead of him taking the gas mask and doing a version that is this cool helm, it is now in this mythology, the gas mask that is a feeble mortal attempt to emulate the Sandman's helm.
Exactly, which I absolutely love. That twist is just beautiful. So yeah, it's very fun kind of finding these things. I may not be able to pick up a lot, but that one I was able to get. All right. So one of the things we wanted to do is go beyond the scenes, right? This is where we are going to talk about everything in its completeness. So this may have some spoilers. We're also going to be talking a little bit about the TV show. So everybody who is not interested in hearing about the TV show or doesn't want to hear any spoilers can go ahead and skip ahead probably about, 5, 10, maybe 15 minutes. I'm not sure how long this is going to take. We're just kind of feeling our way. So beyond the scenes is also where you can send your questions for either me or Alisa, and we will answer them as best we can. Alisa's experience working with the comics gives her a lot of inside information and knowledge to share. And of course, Alisa used to write when she was the editor, the Letters in the Sand part of the comic book experience, which is pretty common part of comic books that we have the editor answering questions. If you have story or narrative questions, I can answer those. So can Alisa, because she's also like an amazing writer. So send your emails to endless@chipperish.com. And we will answer anything that comes in our Beyond the Scenes section. But for right now, what we want to talk about a little bit is the TV show, right? Because the TV show is going to be coming out. We don't know when, but Netflix did give us an official behind the scenes video. So they're clearly ramping up their promotions machine here. And Alisa, did you watch the video?
Was that the one with the artwork? I think I did. It shows the beautiful artwork, and it's so we don't see any of the actual show yet.
We don't have any of the show clips. We get a little bit behind the scenes. We see Neil kind of moving around on sets and stuff like that. But mostly it's just kind of like a quick promotional thing. But it was exciting. Yeah. I was kind of excited to see it. We have been sort of planning doing this podcast in anticipation of the TV series coming out, and to see that machine get grinding was kind of fun. We'll have a link to the video released by Netflix in the show notes. There's also been some discussion of the casting. Gwendolyn Christie of Game of Thrones fame, who I absolutely loved as the Lady Bran. She's amazing. I am so excited to see her in this. And we've got a little bit other casting. There was some controversy, I guess, about the casting of Death.
One of the things about comics is that, it's visual. And so we're going to meet Death. Is it in the next issue or the issue after? But we're going to meet Death, who is she's described as this very young looking, slender, small-breasted, which was a big deal because in that time period, I think all the women in comics were, really well endowed. And she had this sort of elfin goth look, but she was also drawn, as Dream was, with very, very white pale complexions. Now, the thing is, there were also collectibles. There were, limited edition statues and things like that. Yeah. And I think that a lot of people really, really wanted to see their collectible Death statuette come to life. And of course, any mortal is going to have some trouble with that. But they did cast an African-American woman who is not going to look exactly like the bone white incarnation of Death in the collectibles. People have had some trouble with this.
Well, which is a shame because it's Kirby Howell-Baptiste, who is one of my favorite people. I loved her in The Good Place. And I also watched the first season of Why Women Kill, in which she was beyond fantastic. And one of the things that often happens when we have an adaptation is that people look for it to basically be a direct translation, like beat for beat moment moment for moment, just, into another form. And as we were talking about, earlier, form does influence the way in which a story is told. And the whole point of adaptation is that you can take the heart and the spirit of a story and then translate it into a different form. It means there are certain things that are going to need to be changed. Now, Sandman as a comic, I think, is incredibly white. What we see is the vast majority of speaking characters are white. I think the only one that isn't is Daniel Bustamante, who is one of the people who kind of gets caught up in the dream sleepy sickness. And so we follow sort of him through that process. One of the things that we do with that, which is a little unfortunate, is that we do dialect writing, which is something that I have a very, very strong opposition to. Dialect writing is when we write dialogue, spelling things out phonetically to the way that like maybe a particular accent sort of sounds. Anybody who listened to my Outlander podcast or watched Sex and Whiskey, my Outlander podcast, will hear me talk about that I think it's a bad idea because, for one, it's really, really hard to read. On the other hand, it also can seem like you're mocking the people who have that dialect. So the best thing to do is to simply choose words that are formed in the way that sentence structure would be formed by that person, and then that will sort of give you the sense of their accent. But it can look like it's mocking particular ethnicities. And that said, let me again state, as I always do, that we are, all of us writers, everybody involved, products of our culture and our environment, that we grow up seeing these things, that it takes us sometimes a while to sort of ferret out the nuances of that, especially, as white people. Like, sometimes it can be very difficult to see the ways in which the things that you have learned can be destructive. So learning how they are destructive, changing the ways in which we approach those things, and moving into a way to tell our stories that does no harm, that is a process. So when I bring up these things, I am not condemning writers or editors or anybody who let that go. At that time, that was something, you don't know what you don't know, and when you know, you do better. And then that's the best we can do.
And I think that I think Neil was ahead of his time in so many ways. Mm-hmm. As we go through the series, we're going to see choices that Neil made that were really, I think, more progressive than most people were at the time. Mm-hmm. However, if you are doing the exact same thing you did in 1988, then you can no longer call yourself a progressive. We do have to progress if you're going to be progressive. Yes. By the way, an aside, I just did a prose novel for Marvel with the character Rogue, mm-hmm. and people asked, why didn't I write Sugar, Sugah? Uh-huh. And it's because I was taught very firmly that dialect was, was basically mm-hmm. like imprisoning Morpheus. You were going to pay for it dearly, and it was a very bad idea. So I avoided it.
Yes, it is a bad idea. Dialect is definitely a bad idea. Mm-hmm.
But anyway, to go back to, actually, I've got a funny story to tell that, we had a bunch of really gifted artists doing depictions of the endless back in the 90s, mm-hmm. early 90s. And Simon Bisley, who's an amazing and kind of wild artist, gave a depiction of delirium, who's usually done as mm-hmm. this lovely but sort of rainbow insane waif. and she looked badass, which is one thing delirium has never been. Now, all of the endless, part of the mythology is that they look different depending on who is viewing them. And so that, if I am... if I am white, I might see the endless as white. If I'm African American, mm-hmm. I might see them. If I'm a cat, I might see them as a cat.
Right.
But this was a very different interpretation. And so I remember, mm-hmm. debating, and we were saying like, well, the endless, it is part of the mythology on the other hand. And then finally, the editor, Dan Raspler, came up and said, you've got my artwork. And I said, what do you mean? He said, that's Simon Bisley. That's Lobo's girlfriend. And here I've got delirium. And so we exchanged the pages. So anyway, that's a long-winded story. But my point is, for me, I do expect Death to look a certain way. But for me, I think it's more important that she has this sort of waifish, innocent look. And this and an aspect of her that's sort of very deliberately optimistic. And so I certainly don't think, I might have more trouble if, Gwendolyn Christie, who's amazing, was going to play Death because she's got a very different physicality. But, so that's where I net out with it.
Yeah. Well, and the thing is, too, that an actor who is, very, very good at their job can pretty much pull off anything. Kirby Howell-Baptiste is amazing. Like, I have loved her. I haven't seen her in a lot. She's fairly new. But I absolutely adore her. I think that she's wonderful. And having more diversity in any story is always a good thing. Having more representation. The thing that happens is that when we tell extremely white-centered stories, what we're doing is taking these amazing narratives and deliberately making them less accessible to everyone, and that we want them to be accessible to absolutely everyone. So the people who have a problem with that are just going to have a problem until they get over it and learn how to enjoy and open up. If you love a narrative, when you love something, don't you put it in the hands of everybody you know? You want these things to be accessible. You want them to be inviting and open to people, from different backgrounds. And by doing that, and by also not doing colorblind casting where we're like, oh, we're just, going to cast a Black woman in this role, but we're not going to think about what the experience of being Black in the world how that would affect her, even as an Endless, I think that would be a mistake. But if we're putting people in those roles and we're actually allowing the entirety of the experience of being Black, of being a woman, of all of these different parts of experience, allowing that into our narrative, it breathes so much more life into everything, and it makes stuff that you love more accessible to everybody. So decisions like this, I think if you love Sandman, you gotta love this. It's bringing more people to Sandman.
I think and it's interesting because I know, I don't know exactly how the fact that the actress is African-American is going to impact Death, because she is an archetype. But, it strikes me that I've learned that there's this term, the unmarked state. And I used to think of it when I didn't have that language as the default setting. And I think that the default setting for human was for many years a white, skinny, 30-something dude. That was, that was the guy that was the everyman. And the everyman, was a man. And so I think, I think in some ways that for some people, it feels like there's food, which is the food I'm used to eating. And then there's ethnic food, which are other people's dishes. And I think that what we are slowly nudging towards is there is no, the food that I eat and I'm used to, or white 30-something dudes. This is not some universal state and everything else is a variation. We are all variations. And so, I don't know if I'm expressing that as clearly, but I think that people thought in part perhaps that white was the default setting without thinking. They didn't think it. They kind of felt it in the way one feels unexamined positions.
Yes, exactly. And here's the thing, that whenever people have that reaction, creating a space for them to realize that maybe they're not thinking about this and this in its fullest expression, that maybe they're not understanding everything about their response, that they're having a knee-jerk response, and that you can improve from that. You can broaden your view, with the exception of there's people who are actively and deliberately racist and, whatever. But the people who just need to be brought along, You know, like I feel like there's a space for that. And so I'd like to see them come along. I think that however they decide to do the rest of this casting is great. I would love to see as much diversity as humanly possible. I would love to see great stories open their arms to new people who are not the, you know, default 30-something white guy, you know, or, you know, white woman who that guy is big-breasted, small-waisted, you know, white woman that is supposed to be an ideal as well.
I'm also really curious as to how they're going to interpret Death's fashion sensibility.
Mm-hmm.
She was designed to be a goth girl, and goth was much more prevalent in the late 80s and early 90s as a subculture. It meant a certain thing. I won't say that I know everything that's going on. Everything else from the late 80s, early 90s is having a resurgence, including like pleated denim. I thought it would never come back. You know, the denim with like the little pleats and the high waist.
Oh, it's terrible. Yes.
I can't, no, I'm not going to, I liked my pleated denim. I am ready to go back there. No, so I'm very curious how the actress Kirby Howell Baptiste. Kirby Howell Baptiste. I'm really curious how she will embody the role and deliver the lines. But I also really want to know what the hair and makeup and costuming is going to be.
Yeah, I'm very excited to see it. And I am firmly in the camp that this woman can do anything. So I'm very excited. I cannot wait. All right. So moving into our next section here, we have for Sleep of the Just our Byronic Brood scale, where 0 is just sitting here dreaming to 10, which is, where is my goddamn Ruby? All right. So, Alisa, for Sleep of the Just, where are you on the Byronic brooding scale?
Wow. This, I think, is truly, I think it's pretty damn broody. I think it's full, you know, I'm trying to think about what's coming up. Here's my question. The only thing this would keep this from being peak broody is that sometimes when you're in crisis, the brooding and the moroseness is what comes after. So I'm going to give it an 8.5.
8.5. I gave it a 6. I gave it 6
Really?
Because I don't know what our scale is. Like, I know that Sandman, I get the sense that Sandman is going to be pretty broody. Most of this, he's kind of just sitting in a glass or biding his time.
He's totally brooding. He's brooding his time.
What else has he got to do? What else has he got to do? He is brooding his time. So I had it as a 6. Because I wasn't sure like how far we were going to go with like deep brooding.
Is it okay? So if you're brooding, but you're plotting other people's revenge in a kind of patient, slow simmer way, is that brooding? I think it's
brooding. It's just that we didn't see a lot of it. Like it was background stuff. We didn't see him brooding. We saw him look people dead in the eye and be like, hey, no, like that was all he said. And then we spent all of our time really with our protagonist of Sleep of the Just, which of course was with the villain, you know, Roderick Burgess and his son, Alex. So because we didn't spend as much time brooding with Dream, I give it a 6. But I think that Dream, like in his experience, was super broody. So if we're just looking at it from Dream's experience, that definitely bumps it up a couple of points. But because our experience of his brooding was fairly limited.
I think you raise an excellent point. I mean, I'm just assuming that if this whole story had been from Sandman's point of view, it would have been an 8.5.
Oh, it would have been max broody. I probably would have given it a 10, but we weren't in his POV that much. So, you know, it is what it is.
Oh, wait till he starts getting into his ex-girlfriends. Then
I'm very excited.
Yeah, there's always room for more broodiness when, you know, hurt romantic feelings come into play.
I am super excited about that. All right, so now we are to the favorite page. This is where both Alisa and I each pick a page from the reading that was our favorite. And I'm going to, you know, open up the curtain a little bit and give you guys a little bit behind the scenes. Alisa asked me about my favorite page. Now, again, I'm not that, like, you know, I haven't read a lot of comic books. I'm not that well versed immersed in the language of comics. Looking at this, I don't know what is the most beautiful page or what is the most skilled as far as the art and the writing and everything goes. So when she asked me, I was a little bit embarrassed because I was like, well, I don't know if this is actually like the best page, but it's kind of my favorite page. And it is it's number 23 in the Kindle Virgin. There we go. Virgins are an entirely other discussion.
I think it's page 12. I think I don't have a page number on. No, it's page 19 in my Sandman omnibus.
Okay, so in my Kindle version, it's page 23. And it is the page with all the panels that are warped and blue. We're looking, there's circles.
It's like
from Dream's perspective.
Lens.
The fisheye lens, exactly. As we're looking from Dream's perspective inside the orb. And it ends, the final word of the page is patience. Right, which is really Dream's superpower. Yes. The key to his ultimate domination of his captors is just patience. So here we are, so deeply in his experience, looking at his captors through the curve of the orb, and it's all in blues. We just have blue and black and white, and that's basically what the page is, with these 6 little orbs that we're seeing the progression of his experience. And I love that page, and so I was like, well, I'm not sure if it's really the best page or whatever. And then I told Alisa, and Alisa was like, oh, I picked that page too. So now I feel like really validated.
So I'm just going to describe this page a little bit for a second. So this is actually a 6-panel page. Mm-hmm. So a 6-panel page, a panel can be considered, panels are often, if you were to divide a page into 6 and there's some kind of a gutter and a holding line in comics.
And the gutter is the empty space, correct?
The gutter is the empty space.
I've been studying my comic language.
Excellent. I feel like I should have gold stickers when you do that.
Oh, thank you so much. That's what I want. I just want a gold sticker.
We all do. But so this is, each panel can be considered a unit of time in that you sort of pause on that. You could call it a beat.
Yes.
So you've got 6 moments or 6 beats, and when they're equal, it kind of gives that feeling that each takes up the same amount of time. Usually a larger panel is a bigger moment, a longer moment. Smaller panels all crammed together feel like time is going by more quickly. So we've got the 6 panels, and they are really give the feeling of a circular, but like a globe, because it's done as if it's a 3-dimensional. And so we see, and we realize bit by bit that we are actually seeing things through the eye, the eye pieces of the Dream's helm. And so we see for the first time his reversed word balloon, and his first line is trapped.
Yeah.
The second is observe, and then threats, and finally patience. And so we see the people coming to gawk at him like a creature in a zoo, people threatening, people, demanding things. And so all of a sudden, after this beginning in which, as you so, beautifully put, that this is, the featured, the featured, this is supposed to be a Brad Pitt movie, but, we haven't seen Brad Pitt, or we've barely seen him, and we haven't heard from him. And suddenly, in a way that still preserves his mystery, we are in his head, in his point of view. And he's still not giving us very much to go on, but we are in his experience.
Yeah, and it's so incredibly powerful. I really, really love that. All right, Alisa, so overall, Sleep of the Just, what's your favorite part?
So my favorite part, I'm going to skip to, I love to look at the artwork while I'm talking.
Yes.
Because then I can sort of describe. So we've seen, the first time we see Alex Burgess, right? I'm having a moment.
Alex Burgess is the son. Yeah.
Yeah. So I just want everyone to understand that we're recording this at night, and I get stupider with every passing moment until I sleep, and then I'm smart again. So anyway, Alex Burgess starts as the son. So when we first see him at the beginning, he's this little kid with round glasses, and he's got some innocence to him. And we see him as an observer, as his father's doing the ceremony to capture picture. And so in that panel, the father is holding a cat, and we see a little purr, and then we see a knife held. And we understand that this cat is being sacrificed. So now we go towards the end of the comic when finally Sandman is out and going to take his revenge on Alex. And we see that Alex is now an old man, and he looks almost exactly like his father did at the beginning when his father was the old man. But as he passes a mirror, we see that image of him as a younger man. And then he goes into a top like attic room, and we see a black cat. And the black cat walks into a throne and sits in that throne and looks at Alex and becomes Morpheus, becomes Dream. And this is sort of interesting. At this point, I don't think people understood that Dream appears differently, that he doesn't just have one aspect. So, probably for a first-time reader, it's just, oh, look, that cat just becomes, it's another one of his magic powers. But I think it's a wonderfully subtle moment, because why? Why is Morpheus choosing to be a cat in that moment? Why does he not just first appear as himself? And I don't know. I don't remember this. This has been a long time since I reread this before, but I think it's because of that cat that was killed. And as a writer, I think, you can't just throw away, even though it's off screen, a cat was sacrificed. And people have a lot of emotions about that. And, you always have to be
about
really,
animals. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, we feel those things really deeply. And you would think, okay, was that a throwaway moment because this person's a bad guy? And is it just showing us that he's a bad guy? And I think this is a moment that has more resonance. I think that Sandman's choosing to first appear as a cat, as his cat aspect, is that he is also the dream of cats. And we will see more about this later. I don't know if this is not in the scope of I think the comics that we're covering for the series, but I think this is a little visual note that says to me he is taking this revenge not just for himself, but also for one of his dreamers, and that he does not forget differentiating between black and white, that he does not necessarily give preference to human dreamers over dreamers of other species.
Wow. I love it. I love it. All right. So my favorite part is at the end. Dream gets free, right? He travels through the dreams of others. He has nothing. This is his beginning, his time to rebuild himself and his world. And it reminds me of the Tower card in the tarot. And for those of you who are unfamiliar, the Tower is probably my favorite card in the tarot, although it is an absolutely terrible experience to actually have. But the Tower card is when, you've built this tower, you're at the top of it. You've made it every day, every stone, every piece, and then it crumbles underneath you and you fall to the ground with nothing but destruction all around you, and you have to rebuild. And that is where Dream is. He is at the beginning of rebuilding himself. Everything is destroyed. And I love these rise from the fall stories. How do you build yourself back up after losing everything? And that's how we end Sleep of the Just. That's where it ends, with him being like, we're doing this thing, he's getting back into it. He's got a goal and he's just going to build up his strength and get it done. And I absolutely love that. Yeah, absolutely. That was actually another favorite part of mine. And the fact that you get to see his cleverness and his resourcefulness. I think a lot of us were told as writers initially to make a character relatable or likable. You have to make them likable by showing a pet the cat or save the cat moment. Right. Actually, we do have that now that I think about it. But I think that the other thing that we acknowledge now makes characters, if not admirable, then characters that are riveting to us, like Hannibal Lecter, is when we see people being resourceful and smart and good at what they do. And we get to see that in the section that you pointed out. Absolutely. I love it. enjoyed this conversation and would like to join in, connect with the show on Twitter, follow @Chipperish, and use the hashtag #EndlessPodcast. Alisa, where should people find you out on social media?
Oh, I am @Kwitney on Twitter, and I have forgotten my Instagram. So
that's
I'll
okay.
have to
It's
find
probably something similar.
And yeah, I'm on the Facebook, as the children say, as well. Yeah, so you can find me, and I will be back here. And this episode of The Endless was brought to you by the Chipperish media producers who support us on Patreon at the power producer level. These people are the reason why Endless is coming to you free and ad-free right now. So thank you to Abby, Alice, Christina, Erica, Jonathan, Kevin, Kristen, Rose, Sarah, Shelley, Stephania, and Stephanie. Oh, Stephania, and so now we need a Stefania. If anyone named Stefania would like to come and support us, please.
We need you to have the 3, right? A 3 is a magical number. So yeah, we got to fill that out.
And this week's special message for our power producers. The order isn't just a way to make money and get laid. Some of it's real. What am I saying?
You are quoting what we just read. To find out how you too can support Chipperish Media, visit patreon.com/Chipperish. Other ways to show your support: write a great review on Apple Podcasts, tell your friends about the show, or stop your nightmares by going out at night, knocking out bad guys with sleeping gas and throwing sand on them. Because sure, why not?
We will be back next time with Sandman Volume 1, Preludes and Nocturnes, Issues 2 and 3, Imperfect Hosts, and Dream a Little Dream of Me. Until then, to reward you for your years of hospitality, I give you this: eternal waking. And hot flashes.
I love it.
No. So, Lucy.
All right, I'm sorry. Can we do you have like a chirping smoke alarm or something?
I think I do.